All right. So we've got an hour and a half. What I'm going to do is there'll be a couple of chances during the session for people to jump in and ask questions. Please put your questions in the chat as well, and we can have some discussions afterwards. I won't be able to monitor the chat, but we can do that afterwards, and Melanie can maybe help me at the end of that. All right, so welcome. As I say, my name is Carol Bertram. I'm the editor of the Journal of Education, and which is the journal of the SAERA, South African Education Research Association. So what I'm hoping to do here is look at steps to mapping out papers. As I say, mostly I think a PhD is one where you would be publishing more than one paper from a thesis, but obviously you can publish from an MEd as well if you have a sufficient depth of data or a very strong theoretical framework. That's certainly possible to do. So I'm going to start with how do we map papers, then look at selecting a suitable journal. Look at we're going to have a quick focus on free writing to clarify the claim. We're going to focus on how you write your abstract, and then some ideas around starting to write. So let me just begin. So why do we do a PhD, or for those of you who've done a master's? There are many reasons for the PhD. Sometimes it's around really wanting to wear that red gown, wanting that title or that status. Often it's about career advancement. There's a whole range of reasons why we do postgraduate study. But when you're thinking about publishing, a key thing is about disseminating the knowledge. So it's about contributing to knowledge in a particular field. And what we do in peer-reviewed journals is then disseminate this knowledge. Usually it is done through peer-reviewed academic journals, but also, to be perfectly honest, not a lot of people actually read peer-reviewed journals, or only academics do. So if you really want to get your data or your findings into a broader field, you could consider something like The Conversation, which is a newspaper which publishes academic work for lay people. That's really another important place to look. And so look them up if you're interested. And there your readership would be much broader than in a peer review article. But with PhDs, many of you know that in many universities now, you have to show that you've submitted an article for publication in order to graduate. Certainly that's the case at UKZN. A recent journal article by Van Schalkwyk, Susan Van Schalkwyk, Mouton, etc., showed that less than 50%, 47.6% of graduates over the last 15 years or so have published at least one journal article. So that looks fairly high, but it also means that more than half of PhD students, in fact, are not publishing at all, which is really quite a waste, because nobody really is going to read your thesis except for your examiners and your supervisor. Possibly some other PhD students would. So it really, really is important to get that information and that new knowledge, those new claims out. You've got to do it through journal articles. So that really is a key thing. We know that we're all under pressure to publish. Certainly those of us who work in academia, some of you might be lecturers. And we know that we're working within what is called an era of performativity, which focuses on valuing what can be counted. And this article, although it's fairly old now, by Stephen Ball, is still a really excellent article, and I think is as relevant as ever. And what he says is that performativity requires individual practitioners, that's us as academics, to organize themselves as a response to targets, indicators, and evaluations. to set aside personal beliefs and commitments and live an existence of calculation. And many of us, for those of you who are teachers who may be studying, you know that a lot of your work is now measured according to learner achievement. As academics, our work is measured also according to learner achievement, as well as how many articles you publish, this idea of targets, indicators, and evaluations. And what Ball says what this does to us is it makes us uncertain about the reasons for our actions. Do we believe are we doing something because we really believe in it, or because it's worthwhile, or are we doing it because it will be measured or compared? And let's hope that what we can get to a point where we are writing or want to write from our thesis because you actually have something to contribute to the scholarship in your field, and not only because you have to meet a target or you have to do so in order to graduate. But let's do this thing because we actually believe it's worthwhile. And ideally, we want to be writing in order to engage in scholarly conversations about real problems or issues in the field. So in order to do this, you've got to be clear about what your phenomenon is and what the debates are in your field of scholarship and how you can actually then engage with those debates. Kamla and Thompson, I don't know if you have come across their work, very, very good people writing about writing. And they ask the question, what is the contribution, is the key question that you have to ask when you start thinking about writing for peer-reviewed journals. This is an excellent book. I strongly recommend it. They ask the question, so what? What is the argument that you want to make? What actually is the point? Who cares? Who do you wish to persuade? Is it your fellow academics? Is it people who are writing policy? Is it funders? Whom do you wish to persuade? So a key thing is that you need to know who the writers and the debates are in your field so that you can enter a journal discourse community as an informed participant. You're choosing, basically, it's a conversation. It's in all of the fields that we're working within, it might be, online learning. What are the key debates about that? And what is the discourse about it? And how do you then enter that discourse? And what is your contribution to that discourse and to the debates in the field? So a good article does not simply describe or summarize your methods and your data, but it makes a claim or an argument. And this is a key thing to remember. And we're going to keep coming back to this. You've got to use your findings, your literature, your theory to support the particular argument that you're going to make, which is the biggest difference between a thesis and a journal article. So let's look at exactly what this is. And a journal article is not a summary of your thesis. Well, it may be a summary of your master's if that is a fairly small study, but it cannot be a summary of your PhD. The genres of a thesis and a journal article are very, very different. The purpose of your thesis is, to put it in quite blunt terms, it's for your own education, and it's obviously to show how much you know, or have you met the criteria for that degree. Your audience is your examiners, essentially, and your supervisor. Your examiners are assessing that you've met the degree criteria. The length is, for a master's, 20 to 40,000 words, depending if it's a coursework or not, 100,000 for a PhD. And your focus is an in-depth discussion of extensive literature, methodology, theory, and you generally analyze all your data. And you go through that in a very clear and specific kind of way. A journal article is different in the sense that you're contributing to the field of scholarship in a specific way and to a specific discourse. You're writing for peers, for peer reviewers who are going to assess the claims that you're making. You're doing it in a very concise way, 6,000 to 8,000 words. And the key thing is that you're focusing on just one key claim. You're going to make one argument. And so then you're going to select the particular literature, theory, methods, and data that you need to support that particular claim. You're not putting in absolutely everything that you wrote in a very condensed form. So it's not a summary of your thesis. So the first thing is that what I'm going to suggest is your first step is to map out a publishing plan. I don't think that you turn your thesis into an article, the same point I made earlier. You're not going to summarize the entire thesis unless it was a very kind of focused, clear piece of work. You would generally just publish one particular claim from your data in one article, and then you would do the same with another article. So from a PhD, you may have a number of claims, and perhaps also from a full thesis master's. And you need to think about, what is it that you want to say? Do you have an argument around methodology, a claim that you did a different thing methodologically, and that approach helps us to understand the problem in a new way? You know, for example, if in your field, most people have done qualitative work, now you did a huge quantitative study, your methodology is different. Did you come up with then different findings through the methodology? Is it an argument around theory? Did you use a different theoretical lens that hadn't been used before to engage with your phenomenon? If you did, then you could write a paper around that and how that theory helped you to see things in a different kind of way. You may have an argument based on new empirical data that challenges the way that we usually think about a problem, or maybe your data confirmed what we already know. And you may have different kinds of data. Perhaps you collected data in different kinds of ways. So you could then have different articles that focus on different parts of the data, for example, or you might just choose one particular finding from, maybe you just did interviews with 15 people, and you don't have to include all of that data into one paper. You might just want to make one particular claim. So this is really a key thing, is mapping out your publishing plan. Don't jump in and just start to think, okay, here's a good idea, I'm going to publish this, but really choose one key claim that you want to make into one publication. I know you're all at different places. Some of you may be finished, others are still on track, but you really need to think about, how do you make this plan for the different claims that you wish to make from your particular study. And then you can ask the question, which journal would be most suitable for different claims? So if you've got a theoretical claim, you would maybe focus on a journal, a more theoretical journal. A methodological claim, similarly, they're journals that focus just on methodology, for example. So that's why knowing what your point is and what your contribution is so important, because it helps you to select the particular journal that you think will be helpful. So here is a mind map. And here's something that you can think about doing, and you can doodle this as we go along, maybe as we're talking here. You've got your thesis topic, and then there's a range, I'm saying, from a PhD, possibly 5, maybe 6 papers. You might have a theoretical claim, an empirical claim, and another empirical claim, just as an example. You might also have a theoretical, often you put huge amounts of time and energy into writing a literature review. If you've done a really excellent job of the literature review, maybe you want to publish your literature review. But it's got to be driven by an argument. It can't just be a laundry list of literature, but there's a lot of journals that publish those kinds of reviews. You might say, okay, I've done a review of, the studies that have been done in the last 30 years on this particular phenomenon. So the literature is also a chapter that you could think about condensing, but again, make sure that it's driven by a particular argument or claim It's not just descriptive. I did my PhD quite a while ago. 2008 is when I completed. My PhD was around the recontextualization of the history curriculum when there was a previous new curriculum, the National Curriculum Statement that came out in 2006 for the FET band, and I was looking at history and how that had changed. So I had a range of different data which I was able to publish in different kinds of ways. So for example, I had one article that I looked, it was a comparative focus on the history curriculum documents, so the old NATED curriculum and the NCS curriculum documents. So that was one set of data that I had. I also then had a set of data around assessment, where I was collecting learners' assessment tasks. That was another set of data, and so I could publish that in a different kind of, in another article. Another empirical claim was around the actual pedagogy in grade 10 history classrooms. So I had a range of different data and had engaged with 3 different teachers in different kinds of schools, and so published something around pedagogy. I then also had a kind of theoretical paper where I was looking at the theory that I used was Bernstein's theory of the pedagogic device. And then lastly, right at the end, when I was kind of reflecting back on the whole thing, you can see the timing, 2012. So it was sort of 3 years after I'd finally finished the thesis. I was looking more at a kind of theoretical contribution and the sense of saying, here's a language of description. So that's just an example of how one can think about your thesis during. So this was published while I was still writing, as was this one. But the others were then published once I was finished. So that's just one example. All right, so let's go forward. So what I'd like you to do is think about, maybe for yourself now, take a moment and think about which one of these you want to think about, because we're going to take 2 or 3 minutes to focus on just one of those papers. So choose one. It might be one of your empirical claims that you want to put forward. It might be your literature. It might be a methodological claim or a theoretical claim. Think about which one of those you want to focus on. And then we're going to just take 3 minutes to do a bit of free writing. So the key thing with a paper is that there's one idea and one paper. If you have 2 ideas or 2 claims, then you have 2 papers, which in this era of performativity is a great thing. But what I want to do is just focus a little bit on this thing called free writing or generative writing. And we're going to just take 3 minutes to do this. Generative writing or free writing is using writing as a tool for your own learning, thinking, and understanding. It's not for anybody else. So a lot of the writing that we do, we tend to be writing for an audience. We're thinking about editing, we're thinking about coherence, and that's really important. But this is almost the step that comes before that. And so what I want you to do is think about choose one paper that you think you might take on and answer this question: what do I think is the main argument of this paper? Usually with free writing, you set a time limit, not more than 7 minutes. Now we're just going to take 3 minutes. So take a piece of paper, or you might just want to clear your laptop screen. You write without stopping. Don't edit. Don't worry about spelling, grammar, punctuation. Nobody else is going to read this. You might want to do it in a mind mapping kind of way, in a drawing, or a linear kind of way. Write in any language you like, by hand or on your laptop. So ask this question: what's the main argument of this paper? And these are some other questions that you might want to might help you. What am I writing about? What's the phenomenon? What is my main argument? And why is it important to make it now? What evidence will I use? And you may get to this. How may other people counter the argument? Why am I writing this? who am I writing it for? All right, so let's take 3 minutes. It's 16:22, so 16:25 we'll stop. So pick up your pen or put your cursor on your laptop and just start to write about what's the main argument of this paper. What's your phenomenon and what's your main argument? Go. All right, so that's 3 minutes, not a very long time, but hopefully that gave you something to start focusing on and something to start thinking about. If you want to write about that experience in the chat, that would be great if that was helpful. What I suggest is it's very useful if you don't use one to have a research journal, a little black book. It could be an A5 book or an A4 book, or if you prefer your own laptop, to write, keep all of your ideas, the things that you read, the key things that are important, keep them all together. And this kind of free writing is really important to have that. So when you're focusing on a particular article, you can go back and say, okay, so what did I say the key point here was? What was the main argument? This thing about free writing, sorry, I'm just going to give a little punt here. A couple of weeks ago, there was a really useful webinar hosted by ASAF in the Journal of Science, Writing for a Scholarly Journal. It's long, it's 4 hours, which obviously you don't have to listen to the whole thing. There were many, many speakers, but the first speaker was Prof. Chrissy Bowie on what good writers do, and highly recommend her presentation. All right, so if you've mapped your thing out, you've got a sense of maybe the different articles that you might map out. You've chosen one. You've done a bit of free writing, you've got a sense of the phenomenon. And then the next thing you're going to do is select your journal. which may seem a bit counterintuitive, that and often you might think, well, I'm first going to write the paper, then I'm going to select the journal. And that is not a good way to go about it. You need to know which journal you are targeting before you start writing in earnest, because it's about entering into a conversation. So again, Kamla and Thompson talk about targeting the right audience. Who do you want to read it? Who is the discourse community? So your first thing to discuss or think about, is it national or international? Is your particular claim that you want to make more focused on a national or an international audience? This is really important. So that's your first key selection to make. Then you need to decide, is it a general journal, something like the Journal of Education, or is it very specific to the field? You know, so if you're working, for example, in e-learning, you could either choose a general journal, or you could do one, select a journal that just publishes in technology, education technology and e-learning, for example. And again, the audience is going to be very different. So if you're writing into a general audience, you need to probably explain concepts and provide a lot more detail and explicit definitions. Whereas if you're already writing to a specific field, you can maybe assume certain things, that the people reading that journal already know particular things. And then, is it for practitioners, for academics, for policymakers? Who are you writing to convince is the key question. So obviously the audience and the journal goes together. So it's talking about what journal publishes your kinds of research. So very important to know the scope and the focus of the journal. You will find that most editors of journals will tell you that a lot of articles get rejected before they even go to review, because it doesn't fit the scope and focus of the journal. So you need to read it. You need to do your homework in terms of knowing who publishes in this journal. You know, what are the key debates and what are the key conversations in the journal? So look back at the last 2 or 3 years. What's been published in that journal? You might find something, you know, an article that's really useful, that's really important, that speaks to the same debates, and you could continue that debate. So yeah, this thing about knowing who to target is really important. Does the journal favor a particular methodology? Is it mostly quantitative or qualitative? You know, there's some journals that are focusing particularly, for example, on action research or self-study. So don't target those journals if that's not the methodology that you used, for example. So this is really a key thing, and it takes time. So don't skimp on selecting your journal. Don't do it at the end and just think, oh, where should I send this? What I'm arguing is that you need to do that before you actually start your writing. A good colleague of mine, Vaughan John, from KZN, UKZN, published this article recently. And he said I could speak about his experience. He works actually within the field of adult education, but this particular focus was on this project called the Alternatives to Violence Project, which is a peace education program. And Vaughan targeted this journal, which is actually an American Psychological Association journal called the Journal of Peace Psychology. And Vaughan said it was a really interesting process because it's not a discourse that he usually works in. Psychology is a discourse that's quite different. And you can see from here, it took 18 months from it being received and to it being accepted, and it's just been published. So in fact, it was 2 years in the making. This is a top journal, a quartile 1 journal. And so obviously, if you choose a very high-ranking international journal, it could well take you 2 years to get published. He said it went through 5 rounds of reviewers' comments very detailed, very specific. And the key thing Vaughan was saying was that it was about how evidence is used and cited, and the kinds of evidence in psychology that is needed is very much randomized control trials, those kinds of things, not qualitative data. So this is what it just seemed like a good example to sort of talk about who is your discourse community, who are the people that you are writing for, and what is the particular discourse in that field. And then the next thing you need to think about is, particularly if you are planning an academic career, this might not be that important if you are not, is where will you get the most impact and readership? So often if it's a South African journal, you would get more South African readers, of course. So the standing and the accreditation of the journal is really, really important. You've got to choose quality journals and not predatory journals. I'll talk about that a little bit later. You need to decide, is it an open access journal or a subscription? I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Who keeps copyright? Is it you or the publisher? Remember, if you are selling your journal essentially to the big publishers like Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, you lose copyright. You cannot publish that, you cannot distribute your article in any way. You cannot put it on ResearchGate or any other space. You need to check the cost of publishing. The article publishing charges can be very high in some instances, and you need to make sure it is, at least in the South African context, accredited by DHET in order to get some subsidy for your university. Usually DHET will pay the university some money, 60 or 70,000 Rand for every article that is published. And depending on how your university works, that money might come to you, or it might go to your supervisor, or it might just go to the general department. So that's also an issue to think about. And then having a publishing plan is what we've talked about. In order to find out which are good quality journals, you can go to Schimago, and they rank journals. Now, ranking of journals, it's also, some people don't, because also it depends which, it's like the ranking of universities. It all depends on what criteria you use. But anyway, Schimago uses this thing of quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4 journals. So quartile 1 are the most highly ranked. And you can type your journal into Schimago and you can see what ranking it has. So I just typed in here education rankings of journals, and you'll see that the Review of Educational Research is the top ranking journal, so-called, in the world, according to this particular journal ranking system. So Schimago is one that you can look at. In terms of predatory journals, you may not be familiar with this term. Essentially what predatory journals are, this is a definition of it. They're entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and a use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. So I get these, a couple of these every week. You know, hello, this is me. It all looks very good. It's an international peer-reviewed journal, etc. Please submit. But here's a key: publishing your research quickly is one of our top priorities. If they promise to publish it quickly, generally it means that there's no peer review, which means that good quality editorial and publication practices are not being adhered to. The best practice is blind review. And that can take time. So they do promise to publish quickly, but they can really harm your career. And so particularly if you are planning to move into a PhD, I mean, academic career, the NRF, for example, will check to see if you are publishing with predatory publishers. So there are different ways of, you can just simply type that into Google, is such and such a predatory journal, and you should get information around that. But you can ask your supervisor as well. All right, then just quickly in terms of how people access your article, I am very strongly in favor of open access. So one of the options is that the user pays and the author publishes for free. So what that means is you as the author don't pay any kind of fee, and your big for-profit publishers like Taylor and Francis, Routledge, Elsevier do not charge you a fee. So for you, it's free, but they charge the reader. And if for any of you who've tried to get access to articles here, you will see that often it's $30 or $40 if you actually want to read the article. So what that means is that your article is not necessarily very accessible, except maybe to, well, it is, to academics in the developed world, where university libraries have huge amounts of money to pay millions of dollars for databases. And therefore, if you are a member of that university, you can access those databases. So you can access the articles freely if your university pays for the database. But if it doesn't, then it can be quite expensive. And it does mean that maybe people, for example, in Africa or South America, would not be able to buy your article because their university may not have access to that database. The open access option means that often the author pays, hopefully a small publication fee, and it means the reader reads for free. So essentially, open access, like the Journal of Education, many South African education journals are like this. Your APC or your article publication charge might be between 4,000 to maybe 7,000. Sometimes it can be quite a lot higher. So you need to talk to your supervisor and about who would pay for that fee. Make sure you check the fee. But what this means is that usually you get copyright to your article, and then you can publish it on places. You can distribute it freely through ResearchGate, etc. All right, so I'm spending quite a lot of time on this, selecting your journal, because it really is important. Ask your colleagues, your mentors, your supervisor for advice, which journals they publish in, which journals take a hell of a long time. You might find somebody, it looks fine, and it is a good quality journal, but they might say, geez, that's going to take you 2 years before you get published. You might not want to take 2 years. You might want to try for 1 year rather. So it really does depend. You need to think about who are the primary authors that you rely on in your research. Where do they publish? Use Google Scholar, and then, read the various journals, follow the debates, see what kind of stuff they publish, and see how you can enter the conversation. Once you've selected the journal, get all the requirements, get the guidelines, the maximum length, the referencing styles, the charges, the open access policy. These are all the kinds of things you need to know. I was caught out quite recently, was it last year, with a PhD student of mine who published in a South African journal, and we didn't realize that the article processing fees were actually 16,500 Rand, which I think is very high. So please be careful and anticipate that you might get rejected by one, and then you simply submit it to the next one and the next one. So have 2 or 3 journals lined up for one paper. Just to quickly go through some South African journals that you may or may not know that exist. This is the journal that I edit. It is a generalized journal. So if you have something that is very specific, for example, about how grade 10 learners learn geometry, that is too specific for this journal, and it would be more appropriate for a maths and science journal. This is a journal of language learning. If you're working in that field, it also has, so you can see it looks at language practitioners. So again, look at the scope, teachers, language. So if you've got something that is of practical Nature, this might be a worthwhile journal for you to look at. If you're publishing in the field of childhood education, there's the South African Journal of Childhood Education. The APC is 800 Rand per page. That can add up. If you've got 10 pages, that's 8,000 Rand. Education is Change is also a generalized journal, but specifically focusing on critical issues of equality in education and transformation. So if your paper is not about that, don't submit it to Education as Change. And if it is about that, make sure that you put that forward very clearly. Educational Research for Social Change. This again is a very specific journal that focuses on emancipatory paradigms and participatory methods. If that's not what you do, then don't focus on this journal. So what I'm just trying to put forward is look at the scope and be very clear that that you meet the particular scope of the journal. All right, so those are some of the South African ones. There's the South African Journal of Higher Education, which is interdisciplinary. And then there's another higher education journal, which is Transformation in Higher Education. Again, a focus on transformation, like Education as Change. So think about those particular things. These are just the South African journals. Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning, also about higher education. It's about scholarship of teaching and learning in higher education. So you need to theorize and reflect on higher education teaching and learning practice. So if it's about school teaching, don't submit it here. And then this is a much more general journal, the Independent Journal of Teaching and Learning. This is a very generalized journal that you could certainly look at focusing on. It is on applied teaching and learning. So again, if you've got something to do with the application of theory, that might be a useful journal to look at. It's open access and there are no page fees for that one. Recently, ASAF did an overview of 17 South African journals. I've looked at some of them here, not all of them. So this is a very useful report if you want to look on the ASAF site. It was published last year in March, and it gives you an overview and some engagement on 17 journals in South Africa in education. So that's a very good resource if you're looking to find a good journal. All right. Last two steps. What Kamler and Thompson then argue is once you've selected your journal, the next thing that you should do is write your abstract, what they call a tiny text. And what they say is it helps you to find your focus. It helps you to clarify your contribution. So instead of just plunging in and starting, with the kind of introduction, it really helps you to get focused and to say, okay, what am I doing here? It follows on from that kind of generative writing that we did earlier. That was more free writing. This becomes more structured and focuses on what you really want to say. You need to start to speak with authority, not simply describing and reporting, but it's this claim that you have something significant to say. It's this taking on the identity of a scholar, which is not an easy thing to do, and it's a journey that one starts with a master's or a PhD, and you continue on that journey. Of course, your abstract can change. It's not that you're wedded to it forever and ever, but what they argue is that it's a very good place to start. Their argument is that there are 5 moves that you need to make. You first locate the field of your research. If it's about, e-learning, or is it about curriculum coverage? Is it about special needs of learners? What are the debates? In just 1 or 2 sentences, you're going to summarize that. You're then going to say, what is the particular focus of my paper? What is my phenomenon that I'm focusing on. You're going to briefly describe the methods or the theoretical conceptual lens. You're going to report on your major findings that are pertinent to your argument. And then you're going to summarize your key argument. What do the findings mean to the field? What is your main argument? So this, I find, is a very helpful set of moves. And essentially, you're looking at 2 or 3 sentences for each of these moves. But it really helps you to clarify and condense, you know, what it is that you're planning to do. What I would normally do if I was running this webinar with a bit more time is to start to, you know, actually give you a bit of time to do this. But it's certainly something that you can do going away from this webinar. So the abstract needs to enable the reader to decide whether the whole article is appropriate and is worthwhile reading. This is an example from Thompson. You'll see here that this is an example, researching bullying with students, a lens on everyday life. So location is the empirical field. And simply here, they're saying it in one sentence. Bullying is a serious problem in schools. If it's about e-learning, you might say, you know, e-learning is a growing field, particularly in the light of the COVID pandemic or something. It locates your study. The focus, what is your particular project on? Here they're saying what we did is we're reporting on a project with secondary students to research issues of bullying and safety. They then give one line about the methodological approach. The student researchers used photographs to stimulate conversations with focus groups of their peers. They then report on the findings. The data showed that while there was little serious bullying, there was an everyday practices of name calling, etc. And then their main focus here is about their argument. How does it add to the body of knowledge? And so what they're saying is that this research challenges the notion of bullying as necessarily involving a perpetrator and victim. It offers a new lens. We suggest that this project has implications for the way in which we understand and work for inclusion. I want to just give you one other example here. This is a colleague of mine, Tabitha Mukaretsi, who also completed her PhD some years ago. And she was looking at Zimbabwean and South African early career teachers. And this was just an interesting focus thinking about her PhD, because what she did was she took a methodological stance. So she focused on this particular journal. She had obviously published her findings as well, but she took this journal, the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, and she argues, or she focused particularly on her qualitative data gathering challenges in a politically unstable rural environment, a Zimbabwean experience. So here she takes her actual, her focus, her methodology, her experience of collecting data, and turns that into a paper. So she locates it. She says gaining access to participants in rural, politically unstable settings is what she's talking about. She then says, what's the focus of this paper? This paper discusses data gathering experiences and challenges encountered during field work for a PhD amidst a politically volatile situation in Zimbabwe in mid-2008. She actually doesn't focus on the methodology because, in fact, she's reflecting on how she collected the data. She says what the main findings were. She says the challenges, how she overcame them, how she didn't overcome some of them, issues of poor topography, interview space, and then her final argument is that, in fact, the feelings of frustration, fear, and anger should not stall the research process, but should be handled with flexibility and patience, enhances the researcher's reflexivity and reflectivity, etc. So just an example, again, of how you can use a particular focus of your PhD, in this case, methodology, to contribute to a qualitative methodology journal. All right, so I'm not going to do this because I don't think we've got much time, but what I would suggest is do that, moving on from here, and maybe you want to make that your challenge. Within the next week, try and put together your own abstract, and then be clear what journals you're going to focus, you're going to send it to. So as we finish up, just to kind of say, starting to write, when you start plunge into your paper, in a sense, you don't have to start at the beginning or with the introduction. You can start with your literature if that's where you feel more confident or whatever. Obviously, it's a bit like writing a thesis. It's not necessarily a linear process, and often you come back and rewrite the introduction anyway. It's really important that you don't just copy and paste from your thesis. You don't or can't or should not self-plagiarize. You need to, if you do, you need to cite yourself or cite your thesis. But it's really important, this key thing, as I said, a journal article is a different genre. You've got to start with the argument, lead with the argument. And because your thesis is written for a different purpose and a different audience, it's usually not very helpful to just cut and paste. Have a clear, coherent argument. We've talked about that a lot. It's your key idea. Focus on your ideas and structuring your argument first. So this thing about generative writing, free writing might be really helpful for, you can do that with all of the different parts of your article. Take 3 minutes and just say, okay, what's the key literature that I need to focus on here? What are the key, what's the key debate in the field? That's your own writing, using writing to generate your own thinking and to generate your own understandings. Then you start writing for an audience, and then only at the end do you edit and deal with the technical things. Having critical friends you will read and comment is very helpful. Hopefully a supervisor that is a critical friend or a mentor. Be prepared to draft, redraft again, like you did with your thesis. If you're co-authoring with your supervisor, make it clear who's going to write what. You might want to make it clear who's going to be the key author. These things can be tricky. They're questions of power and positionality. If you feel like you are able to write on your own, then you're going to say, I'm going to do a sole authored paper. And this is particularly important if you're entering into an academic career, or maybe you decide, okay, as a PhD student, the first article will be co-authored. I don't know, but this is a discussion you need to have with your supervisor. How is the co-authoring going to work? The question of finding time, none of us have time. It doesn't lie there to be found. We have to just do it. There is no perfect time. I don't know if you're familiar with the Pomodoro technique. 25 minutes, you can set a timer and just try and write for 25 minutes. And those can often add up. If you wait for this, perfect time of having 3 hours, I don't know, never happens for me. It's a tough one, but it's finding that. And then the last thing I wanted to just say is, maybe this is particularly for PhD students. Often, I certainly found this when I finished your PhD, it's kind of like an anticlimax. It's this post-thesis depression or a slump of like, well, now what? You're certainly not the person that you were before you started the thesis. So sometimes maybe you just need a bit of a break. Don't be hard on yourself if you can't immediately plunge in and start being super productive. This thing about finding your confidence as a scholar is really important, and it happens the more we write and the more we can write within a supportive group and with a mentor and as a participatory process, I think is really, really important. So the journey can be a long and winding road. It can really feel like that. So make sure you have a support group of colleagues, critical friends to write with, read, discuss, think, argue, engage. These are colleagues of mine taken pre-COVID days. Yeah. Here's some resources I've said about these books. This YouTube recording, I think, is really useful. There's a huge amount of stuff on the web, almost too much. And I think if you don't want to actually go down that rabbit hole because you might never come out. But this website by Rhodes University, Enhancing Postgraduate Environments, is very helpful. They have short videos, often they're just 3 or 4 or 5 minutes long, which are helpful. Pat Thompson has an excellent blog on writing. I really enjoy that. This is Sharon Clarence's blog. She's a South African academic. So there's a huge number of resources out there. And those are the references. And I'd be really interested. We'll have some discussion now. But if you want to email me, I'd be grateful. Because it helps me to just think about what's useful in this. What did you learn that you did not know before? What was the most useful thing that you learned? All right, I'm going to stop that there, and I will share these slides, and I'll stop sharing. And yeah, let me start my video. Let me see if there are any comments. Do people want to stick up their hands? Sorry, yes, I will definitely share the recording. All right, Pauline Hanekom says, like the questions in the free writing activity, and I think mind maps are really helpful. That's great. I have a question, Lorato, is the Journal of South African Higher Education specific in any way? Lorato, I think you must go to their scope. You go to their website and read their focus and scope. That's the key thing. With all of the journals, all should have detailed about what they publish, and also if you actually see the journals that they publish or see the articles that they publish, you'll see. All right. Can I start with a focus followed by locating? Yes, I think that's absolutely fine in terms of the good. Melanie's saying, yeah, maybe your university has a policy on authorship. The supervisor has to be a co-author. You know, your university may have that or not. Great. Can the publishing of the journal delay my graduation? I think that depends on your own your own university. I'm not sure. All right, that's all there is in the chat. Does anyone want to put up a hand? Can you use a theoretical lens different to the one in the thesis, asks Melanie. Yes, Melanie, definitely. You know, I think often what we have in the thesis is a lot of very, very rich data. And certainly you can use that data and reanalyze it using a different lens. Absolutely. Yeah. I think the key thing is, you know, there are many different ways one can, in a sense, slice a PhD thesis. Just be careful that you don't start just saying the same thing again and again, because again, that's not very helpful for your academic career. People will start to say, oh, she hasn't said, you know, she's simply just saying the same thing again and again in different journal articles. I think that's why it's so important to have a clear publishing plan to, you know, to be able to know what your key claim or your key argument is, that you're not just recycling the same argument or, you know, the same data. All right, are there any other questions? Does anyone want to stick up a hand or anything else? I don't see any hands. Great. Well, then we will stop there. There's nothing else coming in the chat. Thank you very much. If you do want to just drop me an email about what you found useful, I'd be grateful. Or you can put it in the chat if you want to. Lerato, is it important to state that the data is taken from a PhD thesis? Yes, I would say that it is. I don't know if other colleagues want to say that, but usually, yes, you know, either in the acknowledgements or you would say, yeah, you need to state that the data was taken from a PhD thesis. Melanie, go for it.
Yeah, I think in line with that, also this thing about saying this was part of a bigger study. I always wonder about whether I should or shouldn't say, you know, this data was taken from a bigger study, and how much do you say about what the larger study was about, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think again, it's this thing about the key claims, you know, that you're going to make. I think one can say, you know, that this is part of a bigger study, but in this particular focus, you know, maybe in the introduction or whatever, but here I'm focusing on the theoretical, I'm focusing on the methodological contribution, or, you know, I'm just analyzing a particular part of the data, or whatever. To me, it makes more sense for the reader often if you can say that. Something that Chrissy Bowie said in this in that SF presentation is, she said, good writing is writing that does not confuse the reader or puzzle the reader. So often, you know, it can be puzzling to the reader if some of that detail is not there, but the tricky thing with the journal article is knowing how much detail and how much not. Yeah. Somebody asked for my email address. I'm putting it there. Yes, I'm sure we can share the slides. Yeah. Great. Thank you, everybody. And good luck. So I would really put out a challenge, is to say, go and write your tiny text. Go and write, choose one focus, one argument, and go and write your abstract. And then get going. Select your journal and write your abstract within a week. How about that? Good luck. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bro.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very